Hi, my name is Dwayne Gathers, and welcome to Civitas LA, featuring diverse and emerging voices in this dynamic region who are creating and serving community every day and building a better tomorrow. In these bi-weekly conversations, we hear from, learn from, and are inspired by a new generation of civic entrepreneurs moving our region forward and making Los Angeles a stronger, more resilient, and connected group of citizens. In 1798, José Verdugo was granted 36,000 acres by the Spanish crown, making up most of present-day Glendale, Burbank, Eagle Rock, and Highland Park, which became Rancho San Rafael. In the early to mid-19th century, this land was mostly used for raising livestock, especially cattle. Incorporated February 16, 1906, the City of Glendale, situated between Burbank and Pasadena, spanning roughly 30 square miles and home to just under 200,000 residents, has become the fourth largest city in our region. Beginning in the mid-20th century, Glendale has also emerged to become home to the largest diaspora of Armenians in America. Approximately 80,000 Armenians, about 40% of the population, call Glendale home. The Armenian community in Glendale has retained deep connections to its home country and region, and has fostered deep connections amongst diverse constituents through building and nurturing anchoring institutions such as churches and schools, business networks, and a host of community organizations. With us today in studio for our latest Community Spotlight Glendale, we're delighted to be joined by community leader Ellen Asotrayan and Glendale Councilmember Ardy Kassakhian. Ellen and Ardy, welcome to Civitas LA.
Thank you, Dwayne.
Thank you for having us.
We're grateful to have you here and grateful for this warm Friday afternoon in Los Angeles. Ellen and Ardy, we always appreciate it if our guests will share with our audience a brief personal introduction. Ellen, let's start with you.
Sure. I currently own a consulting firm, but my roots in activism began when I was 15, 16, actually when I met Ardy.
Oh, wow.
In 1999, we had a Armenian-American run for city council in Glendale, where I got recruited from high school, and that really was the beginning of my work in public life and realizing the difference that each of us can make in uplifting voices in our communities. We lived in a very different Glendale back then, and my inspiration was really driven by the anti-Armenian sentiment that I would see growing up in our schools and in our city institutions, which led me to work on campaigns. I went to UCLA after graduating high school. Became the executive director of the Armenian National Committee of America Glendale chapter, where I was there for 6.5 years, then moved on to Western Region, working on uplifting our community, voter registration drives, recognition of the Armenian genocide, and Artsakh. So mainly my work has been around Armenian American issues, and of course, being a Glendalian, my city is very important to me. I served on the Parks and Rec Commission because I'm very passionate about green space. And
well, we had a great episode on park equity several episodes ago, so that's terrific.
Right. So after I left the firm, after I left ANCA, I opened up my own firm, which also gave me the opportunity to work on issues that I'm passionate about, which include women's rights and equity in general and social justice issues. And so through work I also get to enjoy my putting in my passion where it's much needed.
That's excellent. Councilmember, welcome.
I'm the son of immigrants. My folks came to the States in the late 60s to pursue their graduate studies. My father was studying environmental chemistry before that was really a field. His career was spent in making sure that the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soil we live on was free of pollutants. And so his career took him all over the place. We've lived in Canada. We lived in New Jersey. Ultimately, his job would always take us to places where air and water quality was the worst, which is how we ended up in California in the early 80s, when we had a very heavy smog problem. There would be, after the weather reports, these reports of how safe the air would be to breathe the following day, whether seniors and kids should be indoors or outdoors. So he spent a lot of time working in that arena. He's there. Both my mom and dad are retired now. My mother taught high school chemistry for over 27 years in Glendale. I grew up in Glendale. I consider myself a Californian now because when the weather drops below 60, I start, freaking out and trying to find a heavy coat or a sweater. I studied history at UCLA. Started off as a chemistry major, quickly switched. While I was at UCLA, I got involved in student politics. At that time, there was a couple of efforts to establish a chair of Turkish studies funded by money from the Republic of Turkey, and it was part of an effort during the early mid-'90s by foreign governments to try and buy their way into American academia. So I got very active in trying to raise awareness on our campus as to how we should not allow foreign institutions to use the UC name to essentially whitewash their history. In this particular case, it was the Turkish government's complicit and active denial of the Armenian genocide. And so, I started getting active, and, that led me to a couple of internships on the Hill. I interned for a couple of members of Congress, came back, saw that there wasn't a lot of Armenian voices in American political spheres. And at the time that Ellen was referring to, we became involved and active and volunteers for a candidate who ran for Glendale City Council, Rafi Manoukian. He's currently the elected treasurer. At the time, no one gave the Armenian candidate much of a shot of getting elected because of the over 80,000 Armenians, or at that time, probably around 70,000 Armenians you referred to earlier. Only about less than 1,000 voted in city elections.
Oh, wow.
So we became engaged in a effort to try and educate, activate, motivate Armenian voters to come out and vote. And it was a difficult challenge. A lot of Armenians came from backgrounds where they had a deep distrust of the governments, which they tried to flee and come to the U.S. And so we were fortunately successful, but there was a lot of work to be done. The Armenian community's political maturation and growth has taken a number of years. I ran for city clerk eventually because as the chief elections official in the city, I felt that office was not doing enough to do outreach to minority communities and underrepresented communities. And I've dedicated most of my career to making sure that communities that don't have a voice do have a voice, because I do believe that is the fundamental, it's the foundation of our democratic system of governance, that people understand how their government works, why it sometimes may not work, but most importantly, what they can do to make it work the way they want it to. So voting rights, human rights have all been a passion of mine, and I currently serve on the Glendale City Council, and I try to keep that passion alive from meeting to meeting.
Wow, that's amazing. So going back to, I think you've had four terms as city clerk in Glendale, so you've obviously been very successful in the community. But share with us and our audience, particularly since, we're so grateful for the fact that we're now in maybe 34 countries. We have listeners, so that's always great. But a lot of people here don't know this contemporary history, which Ellen, touched on as a resident there. Share with us contemporary history of Glendale as you through your eyes.
Sure. The contemporary history is, I think, one that tracks with global patterns. We have a large Armenian population, as you mentioned, but aside from being the largest population of Armenians in the U.S. and probably outside of the former Soviet Union, it is also one of the most diverse population of Armenians. And what I mean by that is many people who are familiar with Armenians may have an Armenian friend, may know that when someone says, I'm Lebanese Armenian or Persian Armenian or Armenian from Armenia, which was a part of the Soviet Union for over 70 years, that there's concentrations of these communities all over. But in Glendale, you'll run into all of them. You'll run into Venezuelan Armenians, Argentinian Armenians. It makes for an interesting mosaic of culture, each of them bringing with them the flavors of the countries that they left behind to make America their home and to make Glendale their home. So that pattern and those patterns of immigration have tracked with global events. So when the Iranian Revolution happened, you had a large population of Iranian Armenians come. When you had the Lebanese Civil War happen, that was a cause for that large population. The most recent conflicts in Iraq and Syria, the crisis in Lebanon are causing more immigration. And so there's been this constant flow, and that kind of came to an head with an old established power structure in Glendale. I sometimes will refer to it in tongue-in-cheek terms as stale, male, and pale. It was run by a very rigid hierarchy of old white men, with the occasional, white woman that would be on the council, but you did not have much diversity. And in the late 90s, you started having some Latino empowerment, you started having some Armenian empowerment, and that has grown. And today we have a much different city council than we had before. Still could use more diversity, but and that's another topic perhaps for another day. But that has tracked with the changes in the economy of Glendale. A lot of immigrants who are entrepreneurial and hardworking, who have made Glendale what it is. One of our fastest and largest growing companies is a company started by two young Armenians, sons of immigrants. And it continues to attract, I think, that diversity and that kind of entrepreneurial spirit. And it is one of the most diverse cities in Los Angeles. We have, I think, over 100 languages spoken in our school district. We have people from all over the world, and the majority of Glendalians were not born in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, you spoke about some years ago. You said you mentioned how there were elections where there were maybe 1,000 Armenians voted, but obviously that has elevated to the point where you've now got a majority on the city council. So how has the community grown in terms of its own community empowerment to ascend to leadership in business and the nonprofit community and all of these interlocking institutions that have been established throughout Glendale? Ellen?
I think one of the key points is each immigrant community that Ardy mentioned brought with them their own skill sets and their own nonprofits and community organizations that formed, that bonded them together. I think it's critical to note that the voter turnout didn't just happen on its own, and it was a very targeted voter education and outreach effort. And so knowing that somebody came from, let's say, Armenia versus Iran or Syria, making sure that the conversation you were having and the people that were knocking on their doors actually could relate to them, mm-hmm. to ensure, because you're talking about folks that weren't comfortable with the voting system, that they were right. They were hesitant to provide their information to government. There's a distrust. So having your own programs for voter registration and outreach was absolutely critical in bringing that about. And of course, as assimilation takes place and as the children of those immigrants
sure.
grow up and
mm-hmm.
graduate and consider the United States and Glendale their home, it changes the dynamic of the community. That immigrant community is no longer just arrived, but is now first, second, third generation.
So you spent a lot of time on voter education and voting rights yourself, Ellen. So I'm curious, what are you seeing now in terms of voter participation in Glendale? And Councilmember, you can add to that too, please.
I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think particularly in the last several elections, when you look at the trends, I think because of that assimilation, you're also seeing within the Armenian community the conversations that take place around any American household are the conversations that are also taking place, and the divide that also exists within the United States in general, whether it's party lines or issue-based. You're also seeing that trend within the Armenian community. So I think there's diversity in our voter base. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ardy, but if there is the issues that impact everybody, impacts at the end of the day the Armenian community as well.
I would agree with that. I think that, what we're seeing nationally in terms of a heightened sense of cynicism that people have, which drives them further into the extremes of both parties. That cynicism exists among Armenian American voters. They're obviously influenced by what they read, what they hear, what they share on social media. So all of those things are factors, but you still have a lot of people who are active voters, more so. In fact, the younger generation is tracking with some of the trends we saw in the last couple of presidential elections. Very independent-minded, very driven by issues that are important to them. But, it's more than just not really having faith in the voting process. We have to realize that a lot of these folks came from countries where participation in the political process or expressing an opinion that was counter to what their government was trying to impose upon them had dire consequences. We're talking about the Soviet Union, where people could end up in gulags and prison camps, or in Iran, where the secret police could come in the middle of the night and a relative would disappear. And convincing folks that, here in the United States, we have a very different system that you have to have a seat at the table. If you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. You have to have representation. Has taken a long time to arrive at. I also want to mention just briefly about, I focused a lot about in the contemporary Glendale about the Armenians, but I'd be remiss to not talk about other communities that have helped create Glendale. Before the Armenians were the largest minority or had the plurality in Glendale, you had Cuban Americans. We had a very vibrant Cuban population, a German population around the 1920s, 30s, 40s. We had a Italian American population. And, of course, everyone knows Porto's Bakery, one of the great Cuban institutions in Glendale. But it reminds me of how it has changed with the diversity. A story when I was first elected city clerk, there was an event happening at the Glendale Civic Auditorium. Channel 7 was there covering it. And I was hanging out with a couple of the cameramen outside. And one of them said, Glendale's changed a lot in the last few years. This was back in 2005, maybe 2007. And he said, it's changed so much. And I haven't been back here in years. And it's really quite something. And I asked him where he lived, and the place he mentioned was not very far from Glendale. And so I was curious. I said, how could you live that close and not have come by here? We have, the Galleria. We have all this great shopping. We have great food places. And he said, when my family first moved to Glendale, and he happened to be Cuban, he said, when we first moved to Glendale, we settled in the Tropico area, which is the south part of Glendale. It's now what's considered close to Atwater Village.
Okay.
And he said, we were the first Latino family in that neighborhood, and my dad had to go door to door to collect signatures from the neighbors to say it was okay for a non-white family to move into the neighborhood. So when I grew up, I swore that I was going to leave Glendale and never come back. And so that has stuck with me, right? Because that experience tracks with the experience of a lot of people, a lot of minorities who came, not just in Glendale, but in a lot of parts of Los Angeles where, most we think of everyone being neighborly or whatever, but then, oftentimes you run into systems that are unwilling to change or unwelcoming of whoever is new or different. And Glendale has, I think, overcome that in many ways, but it's a constant exercise. And the new generation of whoever is there and whoever is part of the establishment has to make sure that they don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
Sure. Well, I was going to ask you about that because sometimes the arrival and the concentration of new immigrant communities can be a challenge for the old order. So, how was the Armenian community viewed in Glendale, and how has that evolved over the last few decades?
I think I mentioned it in my intro about my own experiences as I was growing up in Glendale. And Ardy actually touched on something that's really important with respect to voter registration and folks coming from places where, if they showed up at your door and took you, it might also mean that you're never going to see your family member again. And so I think aside from voter registration and education and that component, one of the critical things that we worked on was, for example, working with our police department to ensure hiring of more Armenian Americans onto the force and launching sensitivity training programs to walk them through why a family all of a sudden comes out all together when you're attempting to arrest somebody. Because for them, that means that this may be the last time that they actually see their family member. And so I think that we've come a long way when you look at representation on all levels. Like I said, this isn't the city that I grew up in, but I think you still see the ripple effects of that. And I'll tell you, I think one of the key places that you can look at is the most recent election results. When you have a candidate's results based on what their last name is or is not, and not seeing beyond the YN and IN, I think plays a critical role in where we are as a community. And there were so many policies over the years that were meant to discourage Armenian Americans from living in the city or opening up businesses, and we still, I think, have parts of the city, for me anyway, that make it very difficult, for example, to do renovations around your home or open up a small business. And what are the services that you're providing in a way that is palatable to a community that has language barriers? And that, of course, goes beyond the Armenian community. We saw that, I think, across the board during COVID, right? When the most vulnerable didn't have access and information about the programs that were available to them. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that front. And not having a system which has just check boxes saying that they did the outreach, but really creating a system that works enriching the diverse communities that make up Glendale.
Mm-hmm. No, I appreciate that.
By the way, Dwayne, I want to add to your viewers or your listeners who may not be used to hearing Armenian names or this much being talked about Armenians. When Ellen says IAN and YAN, she's referring to the ending of last names. If a last name ends in IAN or YAN, 9 out of 10 times it's an Armenian name. So Cher, who is Armenian, her last name is Sarkisian. Andre Agassi dropped the AN from Agassian. Kim Kardashian, obviously. So Kassakhian, Asatirian. So IAN or YAN. O'Brien is not Armenian.
Right. Okay.
But we'll take him. We'll take Conan if he wants. He has been to Armenia, but he's not Armenian.
Okay.
And so I would, by the way, agree with Ellen on a lot of those points. I think that, one of the things that we have to do, and you touched upon, like how has the community integrated or with nonprofits, there's still a great divide in some areas of Glendale, but you also see progress. Mm-hmm. There are boards and nonprofits who do really see their survival, and more than their survival, their success based on how they can reflect the community.
Sure.
Certainly the city has embraced that. We try to embrace it within our law enforcement, within our firefighters, within the general city staff. And it's a process. It's a process, and we just continually try to improve on the work that we're doing.
Yeah. Well, Councilmember, as an elected official, we'd always like to share with our audience what's the civic conversation of the day. What are some of the challenges, some of the issues? What are a couple of the key issues facing Glendale today, post-COVID?
Sure. Well, I think it's figuring out what post-COVID means. Mm-hmm. That's first and foremost, because it came out of left field. When I was elected on March 3rd, because our elections were coinciding with the national primary, 2 weeks afterwards we went into a lockdown.
Sure.
I took my oath of office over Zoom. A lot of firsts. And a lot of unorthodox way of conducting meetings and interacting and trying to do outreach to the community. Now we're emerging from that. Certainly a lot of people have adjusted, but as the tide has risen, all boats have not been lifted equally, and there's a lot of people who are still left behind, as evidenced by the growing homeless population, which is now starting to affect Glendale, although our situation with homeless residents is much better than other parts of Los Angeles County. But there's that aspect. So housing continues to be a discussion, how we maintain our roads, how we provide the basic services, how we reach out to different communities in ways and in languages that we are able to successfully convey our messages and programs to them. All of those continue to remain challenges. And I think that the most important thing is, how do we make Glendale a place where it is safe, a good place to raise a family with good schools, and how we work together ultimately. I think those are the challenges that are perpetual for any council. There's also the issues of utilities and sustainability. How do we do all these things while being better stewards of the environment? That is a discussion that has only recently been brought forth on the city council. I think a certain zeitgeist, in the country about environmental awareness and sustainability has now pervaded all aspects of government, and I think that's a good thing. So those are all issues that we're working on right now.
Well, certainly, Glendale is, again, we've mentioned is one of our largest cities in LA County, but is also home to some significant economic activity with particularly creative companies like Disney Animation, Marvel Animation, DreamWorks, et cetera. What's been the impact of these companies on the city, employment opportunities, and on housing?
Well, I'll answer that briefly, and I'll let Ellen jump in if she wants to. But we had another thing that came out of left field was the departure of Nestle. And it made national news when Nestle decided to move its headquarters from Glendale and move back east. And, it was a major employer and was a major draw for, including for our hotels, which relied on for business travel, et cetera. So at the time, and Glendale has gone through ebbs and flows. At one point, as you mentioned, it was mostly farmland and it was produce and avocado and orange groves. Yeah. And then as it grew, it became a suburb of Los Angeles, but it was a financial hub. And then in the early 90s and 2000s with the Galleria and the Americana, it became kind of a retail hub. And now, we're seeing the I don't know if it's the slow decline of brick and mortar retail, but certainly it is not what it used to be, with everyone being at home and ordering things online. So Glendale has had to figure out what will provide a sustainable economic model for itself in the future. And in that regard, we are focusing on tech and biotech. We have 3 major hospitals in Glendale.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
We have Glendale Dignity, which is a Glendale Memorial Hospital, which is a part of Dignity Health, Glendale Adventist Hospital, as well as Verdugo USC Keck Hospital. And it's besides that, we also have a number of tech companies that are growing. We have a tech incubator now in Glendale, because we believe that is what will provide the long-standing future, well-paying jobs that will help help the city continue to grow.
We talked about housing costs, and I think in a lot of episodes we've talked about housing costs, and that's the key conversation of our region right now. And I'm just curious to know, particularly as younger generations of Armenians, find opportunity elsewhere, and housing costs are driving people out of the region or out of this immediate area. What does that mean for the dilution of potential political power in the community going forward?
I think we've seen that change in the last 8 to 10 years. You have an influx of the Armenian community moving to areas like North Hollywood, Van Nuys, Sunland, Tahunga, and now in most recent years, more so to like Valencia and Granada Hills.
Further north,
and it really, I think it comes down to housing prices. I think I may be on the cusp of that last generation that was able to afford a home in Glendale without the help of their parents. And I'll tell you, I think I even myself got lucky in purchasing my property at the fall of the market in 2011. But I do see the younger generation, whether they've graduated college and have great jobs, unable to purchase a home. You're looking at $1 million that really gets you a fixer-upper at this point.
Wow.
And it's not. I think it's not just the young, because rent prices are also increasing. You're seeing the older generation that actually helped build Glendale and own small businesses can no longer afford to rent in Glendale, and so again, you're seeing that move out to those areas, particularly for the Armenian community. I think it's also shifting. So those that can afford to live in Glendale, I think are, if they lived, let's say, in Hollywood or elsewhere, they're moving in. But I particularly see a huge demographic change in Glendale in recent years. But I also know that, having worked with the Armenian American community, I know that there's a very large growing population in that area.
I noted that both of you, from reading your bios, both of you served in leadership of the Armenian National Committee of America West Region. Tell me about the work of that organization and how that has informed your civic engagement here locally.
Sure. I mean, my experience working with them was born out of that experience at UCLA. Really addressing the issue. I mean, this last year we were very fortunate, actually this year in April, we were very fortunate to have the President of the United States, Joe Biden, issue a statement that unequivocally called the Armenian genocide by its historically accurate, what it actually was, which was a genocide. And prior to that, every administration had come in making promises of using the genocide word to describe what befell the Armenians, and then it would do verbal gymnastics to call it everything but. Out of that effort, which dates all the way back to when the genocide happened, and great historical figures like Vahan Kardashian and others who fought to raise awareness about this historical injustice, this crime against humanity, the Armenian cause was born. And, of course, with the independence of Armenia from the Soviet Union, the war that happened in Artsakh as the people of Artsakh voted for self-determination, and that vote was violently suppressed by the Azeri government, and then they beat the Azeris in a war with a ceasefire in 1994, only to have that war reignite during COVID, violently, brutally by the Azerbaijani government, aided by Turkey and Israel and Pakistan, and of course Syrian mercenaries that were brought in. It felt like the whole world was against Armenia. All of these things are part of what I would say is the existential struggle of every Armenian. every global event that happens, Armenians will feel on their skin because they know someone who's impacted by it. They have a relative. What's happening in Syria, the destruction of the city of Aleppo and Damascus have all resulted in, like what we said early on, these waves of Armenians fleeing those places of conflict. And the one constant in all of this is advocacy organizations like the Armenian National Committee, who are advocating for Armenians in the halls of Congress, in various state capitals. And so I was fortunate to be given an opportunity to work for them in the early 2000s. I worked for them for a few years, and I always believe in the mantra of Aram Hamparian, who's the executive director in D.C., and he says our job at the ANC is to put ourselves out of a job, which is to open the door for the next generation of leaders. And so after I was gone, I think after about 3 or 4 other people that took on that role, Ellen was the person who took the helm at the Western region. And I will say that it's an important cause. It's one that even though I'm not actually involved in it, it's one that the Armenian causes you're involved in, whether you are on staff or not. In fact, I would even argue and say this interview we're having on this podcast is part of the Armenian cause because we're raising awareness.
No, we appreciate that. Well, certainly I know when the conflict erupted in Artsakh in late 2020, the community here and their allies, took to the streets of Greater LA to raise awareness about this. And this episode actually is being released on November 10th, which is the date that the armistice was signed. So can you speak to the activities here and what that means, and how have things progressed since then?
I'll say that I haven't seen that level of activism in my years. And speaking to those that are much older, I don't think any of us had seen that kind of activism from the community. Really, Armenians from every walk of life were joined together in an attempt to help Armenia and Artsakh. I think every professional used every tool that they had, whether it was fundraising for Artsakh or for creating platforms to make sure that we were fighting the misinformation that Azerbaijan and Turkey were putting out. This war wasn't just in the field, but it was also on social media. You witnessed time and again the misinformation that Turkey and Azerbaijan were spreading, and community was really fighting bots that we, we not only the community but also the media was picking up. So you were fighting inadequate coverage of what was actually taking place during a time when the rest of the world was distracted. We had the elections coming up in the United States, so
Sure.
we wholeheartedly believe that was perfectly timed for the U.S. to be distracted. On top of the fact that, of course, it was COVID.
It was totally orchestrated. I mean, much like the Armenian genocide, which Turkey carried out under the guise of the First World War, not to mention the Spanish flu. Similarly, during this time, it's no mere coincidence that during a global pandemic, while the world was distracted by so many other concerns, the government of Azerbaijan decided to take advantage of that. And the fact of the matter is, much still remains unresolved. I have, as a human being on this planet, I have never felt more alone, and I empathize now. And quite honestly, I empathized with the Black Lives Matter activists and movements as well, because you realize what it's like to have and see your people killed and no one really pay moments of attention to it. Or if they do, it's just in passing as they're scrolling on their social media feed as they move on to hit like on a picture of someone's breakfast or lunch or, the next dance craze on TikTok. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly frustrating. And, I saw a phrase during that time online and social media that was something to the effect of, your Armenian friends are not okay right now. Mm-hmm. And that was absolutely true. It was very hard to see these traumatic images that reopened old wounds and scars. Images that we had seen from 100 years ago of the genocide, thinking that was in the past, and thinking that, this is happening all over again, and the world is remaining silent. And again, it was a point of intersectionality with other communities who are also struggling and seeing similar impacts on them and crying out and not being heard. So it became an Armenian cause, but it also happened at that time when we were having a lot of civil unrest, demonstration, and it was an interesting. It's been an interesting year. I'll leave it at that.
If I may add before we move forward, because we went from talking about the Armenian National Committee of America, which is an advocacy organization. Sure. I think the beauty of organizations like the ANC is it's people powered, right? Mm-hmm. It's through activists and hundreds and thousands of activists that dedicate their time to the Armenian cause. And you have the ANCA and organizations like the ANCA fighting on one side, and then what you had during the war, pre-war, during, and post, is Turkey and Azerbaijan basically buying our elected leaders through lobby firms and PR firms. And so one of the big things that the Armenian community here was trying to shed light on and get canceled are all these PR firms that were basically hired as the guns for Turkey and Azerbaijan to disseminate false information and to ensure that proper action wasn't taken during the war to sanction Turkey and Azerbaijan.
And what was the response of our local elected officials in Washington, D.C., those who represent our communities?
Generally, it's been positive, but talk is cheap, right? I mean, we have a history. If you read Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell, which chronicles America's response to global genocides or genocides around the world, you see that we talk a lot, but we do very little in terms of action. And it's frustrating. It is truly frustrating. There hasn't been... We have yet to, first of all, America, most people should know this. If they don't, they'll know it after hopefully hearing this podcast. America was one of the last countries to sign the United States Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide.
Okay.
And they didn't do that for a long time, and they only did it for political reasons because at the time Ronald Reagan, who was president, had gone to Germany and spoken at a cemetery where there were Waffen-SS officers buried, and it created such an upheaval from Jewish Americans and like-minded people who, for the right reasons, called the president out. That, I think, out of probably a sense of guilt and shame that the U.S. finally signed on to that convention. But, our friends in Congress, our friends here in the state legislature, they all said and did the right things, but they can only do so much. After that, I think it takes the president to pick up the phone, and the war could have been, stopped by decisive actions by the world's major political leaders, namely the United States, Russia, France, the UK, Germany. But, global pandemic, President Trump really had other priorities as he was facing a do-or-die election, and the price for that was the lives of 5,000 or roughly over 4,000 young Armenian men.
So where do we go from here? What do you see for the Armenian community in Glendale and the greater Los Angeles region moving forward? Ellen?
I don't think that the Armenian community is any different than we have our own culture, and we are very tied to our roots. I think we continue to educate our friends and neighbors about those roots. But what I've seen is a community that continues to become more involved and more active in the political and civic life of the cities that we live in. And I think we still have a ways to go, whether it's in Glendale or just most recently, I have to bring this up, during the Los Angeles City redistricting is happening. Right. And what happened with the redistricting commission is just absolutely unbelievable, where they were literally cutting up the Armenian community into different districts.
Gerrymandering it.
It's just, to think that in this day and age, the commission that is supposed to be responsible for making sure that each community gets a voice to butcher a community that way, where we actually, again, had to organize. I think it still hasn't been decided, if I'm not mistaken, whether the first Armenian American to be elected to the city council will still remain to hold his district of Armenian Americans, which is Councilmember Paul Krikorian, right. Or if his district will be moved. And I think that with all the good that comes with the progress that we've made, I think we have a long way to go. And the activism is the key to all of that.
Sure. Well, certainly, the key goal of this podcast is to foster more civic knowledge and engagement. So what you're doing is terrific. Councilmember, as the elected official here, share with us your thoughts on the future of Glendale. What do you see?
Well, I'm bullish on Glendale. I think Glendale's a great place to live in, to work, to set down roots. And, we have a fantastic public school system. We have a fantastic community college, and our city council is okay too. I think that
it's one of the safest cities.
It is one of the safest cities. It is one of the cleanest cities. It is a city where, truly, nestled in the mountains of the Verdugos. I think that you will be hard pressed to find a more picturesque, more beautiful suburb of Los Angeles. And we are really a suburb, right? Because you can be in downtown LA in 10 minutes. You can be in Chavez Ravine watching the Dodgers and be back home in a matter of minutes. I think that it is, I think Glendale has a lot of growth still to come. What that growth will look like will depend on our community and how our council works with our community, how we empower different groups to have a voice. And I've always said this, it's a paraphrasing of Bill Clinton's inaugural address about America, but I don't believe that there's anything wrong with Glendale that can't be fixed with what's right with Glendale. And what's right with Glendale is its people, the people that call it home. I think we have a solid financial foundation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if we can do a couple of things that are a little forward thinking, like focusing and investing in tech and the infrastructure to support tech and making sure that that's an equalizer for opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds to create opportunities for themselves, then the future looks bright and the sky's the limit for Glendale.
Well, that's great. Well, we certainly look forward to your years of leadership. Do you have aspirations beyond the City Council in Glendale? Do you want to share anything on Civitas LA?
So I was remiss to say in my bio that I am married happily with a wonderful son.
Okay.
And my primary goal is to be a good husband and a good father. And everything I do on the City Council is with those two most important constituents in mind. If I can make Glendale a better place for my son so he doesn't have to face the struggles that my generation or Ellen's generation faced, that him and his contemporaries, his generation, can grow up with more opportunities, then I'll be a happy person, and I don't need any other accolades or titles to make myself happy or satisfied.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. So we know there's a lot going on in Glendale, and you just laid out this wonderful community and your aspirations for it. So share with our guests an insight look at your Glendale through our lightning round questions.
Oh,
are you ready?
This is awesome.
This is usually the hardest part of the podcast, where we get to get a sense of your Glendale. Favorite restaurant or two, Ellen?
Well, I'm not going to do one or two. If I'm having breakfast, it's Creamy Spoon. If I'm having lunch, it's Heritage Eatery. Eden on Brand is probably my favorite for dinner.
Okay.
And actually, Mamitas is also.
Okay, I like that.
So I'm a foodie. We have great places to eat in Glendale. So
absolutely. Councilmember?
Yeah, I think that if you're looking for Middle Eastern food, you will not find a better place to have it than in Glendale. If it's kebabs, Rafi's Place,
okay.
Carousel, Phoenicia, all fantastic. If you've lived in LA and you haven't visited any of these places, you are missing out. But then La Cabanita in Montrose has great Mexican food.
Okay.
There's a lot of great places.
Okay.
Oh, and Mini Kebab. Mini Kebab by the New York Times was voted one of. It's a hole in the wall, just has two tables.
Okay.
In it.
It's amazing.
Only two tables.
Yes.
Okay. Give us a favorite watering hole or coffee shop, a place to gather for a sip.
Urartu. Urartu is like.
Oh God, you said that both simultaneously.
Yeah, exactly. We had it planned. Yeah. No, on Artak Street, there's a little coffee shop called Urartu. It's a great little place that's been there forever. It's very friendly. I would also say Highlight Coffee across from City Hall is fantastic.
Okay.
They have really good iced cappuccinos.
Yeah, their butterscotch latte is sinfully good.
Okay.
I'll also have to say Oak and Vine for a water hole.
Favorite place to take a visitor, Councilmember?
I would say the coolest thing in Glendale that most people don't realize is, so along the San Fernando corridor, as you get closer to Burbank, is where the DreamWorks Disney campuses are. And there's a street called Airway. And Disney recently renovated the early air terminal, the Glendale Central Air Terminal, which people don't realize was the original Los Angeles International Airport.
Interesting.
Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, they all flew out of there, and you can drive by and check it out, and it is super cool. And, Hughes made a bunch of his air films out there, too.
Give us a hidden gem, Ellen.
It would have to be a nook I found at Brand Park some 15 years ago. It's at the start of a hiking trail that has stairs, and it's kind of hidden. It's my riding spot.
Okay.
So that would be my gem.
Councilmember, give us a hidden gem that nobody else knows.
The hidden gem that nobody knows. Well, if I say it, it won't be hidden anymore. But
go my route. So, like you say a place where people have to go looking for.
I will tell you. So there's an ice cream place in Montrose, which my son, we all love. It's called Moo Moo Mia, and it is fantastic. They have great ice creams.
Okay.
I would say it's worth the drive just to come out to Glendale and try it.
So
who doesn't love ice cream?
Who doesn't like ice cream? Exactly. So we love community events, and it's share with us your favorite community event in Glendale.
Unity Fest, was it? Councilmember, we need to bring it back.
No. So I will tell you, my favorite event is something we started about 3-4 years ago. It was a Dia de los Muertos event.
That's my second.
The Dia de los Muertos event was started by Latino activists in Glendale. It's a Latino event that takes place on a street named after an Armenian region right next to a Korean barbecue place. If that's not Los Angeles, I don't know what is.
That's wonderful. Well, Ardy and Ellen, we appreciate you joining us this afternoon, and we so appreciate your leadership, not only in Glendale, but for our region. And as we say on Civitas LA, we love to give our guests the final word. So share with us a final thought or call to action. Ellen?
I think one takeaway from today would be to engage with your neighbors. I think the more we learn, particularly these days where people determine and label others based on one-liner headlines on social media, to truly engage. And I think the more you talk to your neighbors, the more you talk to friends or folks on social media that you think you may disagree with, at the end of the day, I think we all want a safe place to live, a good place to raise our kids, and have more in common than we think. So that would be my call to action.
Councilmember, a final thought or call to action?
I would just say be good to each other. As Bill and Ted would say, be excellent to each other. I think that we need more of that, and be weary of public officials or politicians who try to make policy based on simplified slogans and are not introspective. And I will for instance, when people tell me, do you like pizza? It's always about the details. If you tell me do you like pizza? I love pizza. But the second you put pineapple and ham on it, that's when I'm not with you anymore, right? So
you can't say, me.
Yeah, and my wife, she loves Hawaiian pizza. But the point being, ask about the details. Details matter. Find out what legislation is really about, and take the time to learn about it and vote for people who take the time to talk about it.
Well, this has been a really instructive dialogue, not only about Glendale, but obviously the Armenian diaspora here, and all that's going on in our region. So we thank you for this dialogue. We thank you for your service to community, and we look forward to following your respective leadership in Glendale in the years to come. To our audience, as always, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we hope you will join us in 2 weeks for yet another great civic conversation. Until we meet again, stay strong and get involved. To learn more about Civitas LA and to share feedback on this program or recommend a future program, please visit us at www.civitasla.com. And don't forget to connect with us on Facebook at Civitas LA, on Instagram at Civitas_LA, and on Twitter at Civitas_LA.